Hey folks, it's Tom at FrugalPrepper. I'm at lunch. I have a little time. I'm going to do a quick video. At the range, I see a lot of people just completely frustrated trying to sight in their AR-15s. They're not hitting anything. They're going through hundreds of rounds. They're going all over the place. First of all, if you're going to adjust your sights on your rifle, you need a good, stable resting place. I use a sandbag that's filled with popcorn, and that's what I use to rest my rifle on, so that I can hold it as steady as possible to make that shot. For scopes, there's all kinds of difference. I use a 1x prism scope. This kind of applies to red dots too. For your MOA scopes, these are minutes of angle. So 1/16 of a degree is a minute of angle, and that's usually about 1 inch at 100 yards. And then the number of clicks per minute of angle varies with each scope. You'll have to see. Cheap scopes might be 1/4 minute of angle per click. Really expensive super sniper scopes might be like 60 clicks for a minute of angle. So you can really adjust them really fine. But most of your cheap scopes are going to be probably 1/4 of a click, which is good enough for 100 or 200 yards. Then you have scopes that work in inches, all right? And those scopes that work in inches are usually 1/4 to 1/8 inch adjustments per click, but they can be any amount, so you have to look that up. But basically that means if you're aiming 1/4 inch too high, you turn it down one click and it would drop it 1/4 of an inch, or 2 clicks of its 1/8 inch adjustments to drop it. So you move the scope thing to the down position to move the bullet down. You move it to the left position to move it left to the right. There'll be a little arrow on those little things that click that tell you which way's up and which way's left or right. And those clicks, again, they vary between different scopes. And if you don't know, you can just play with it. All the scopes I've seen have been 1/4, 1/8 inch, or 1/4 MOA per click, because I don't have any really expensive scopes. As far as expensive scopes, I don't think you really need them when you're talking about 100 to 200 yards. You could adjust just about any scope to that. Monstrum Tactical is the scope that I run. It's a 1x prism with a lighted radical. It was like $69, right? And it is a perfect scope for my SBR, which is always going to be for engagements less than 100 yards, although I can make kill shots out to 200 with it. It has no magnification. So your magnification, your first number in your scope, like, is your amount of magnification. So if it's 8, it's 8x magnification. Your second number is the diameter of the tube. So if it's 34, it's 34 millimeters. You also have inches there too. And then the little thing that turns on the back of the scope, that's your parallax adjustment. So when you look through a scope, where you lay your head, how close you are, will give you a different parallax through that scope. Some scopes have really bad parallax, like a whatever they are, those little cheap BB gun scopes, Tasco or whatever, crappy parallax, right? 1x prism from Monstrum seems to have great parallax, but it still has an adjustment. On my last shooting video, you can see me adjust that a little bit, just to get your impact right on. And if somebody else shoots your rifle and they put their head in a slightly different place and look through a different eye, or whatever, the parallax is going to be off for them too. The rear sight adjustment on, so now we're going to go to iron sights. So your rear sight adjustment, if you need to impact it right, you move the sight right. If you need to impact more to the left, you move it left. So you move it in the same direction that you want the bullet to go on the target. On your front sight, you move it down and it shoots higher. You move it up and it shoots lower. So the front sight's reversed. So when adjusting fixed sights, you have to keep that in mind. Now, I don't know how many clicks or whatever per that at 100 yards is. I just shoot a few rounds, do a few clicks, shoot 4 more rounds, maybe do another click or two, and it usually gets it dead on. Now, how do you sight your rifle out into 200 yards if you're talking AR-15s? I have a special target here. As you can see, the black dot's where you aim, the gray dot's where you're going to hit, right? And so you put this out at 10 yards, right? And it will sight it in perfectly for 50 and 200 yards. It'll be somewhere in the middle of those for 100 yards, right? And so you'll have to learn where to hold just a little higher, a little low to hit dead on at 100 yards. But that's because the bullet is still climbing when you're getting to 1,500 yards. It's reached about the top of its climb. Or I guess it hasn't reached the top of its climb yet. It reaches the top at about 100 yards. But it's still climbing when it passes through at 50 yards, right? And then it's dropping when it gets out to 200 yards. That's a 55 grain bullet. Other weights of bullets could be a little different, but I haven't noticed it. So this is something you can put up at 10 yards at your indoor range to sight your rifle in for 200 yards and for 50 yards, and 100 yards will hit in between there. The reason that you have to aim up here instead of down there is that when you're at close distance with an AR-15, your sights sit much higher than the actual bore of the rifle. So you have to aim higher to sight it in lower, right? And then that gets it on for 50 and 200 yards. But you can download this target online. I'll try to put a link to it, and just print some of these up and take your rifle to the range and get it sighted in. Red dots generally work the same way. There's a number of clicks per inch or whatever, but you can just click them and it'll have a little thing that says up, down, and left and right on it, and it'll hit. Now, if you have an astigmatism like I do, I find that the CV Life red dot, the cheap one on Amazon, really doesn't affect my astigmatism. Most red dots, if I look through them, I see a small little bloom of flowers, like a little flower in there. It's not a crisp dot. It works better if I'm looking through not my bifocals but my regular glasses, and it works better if I keep both eyes open than if I keep them closed, because you're kind of focusing on the target and seeing the red dot in this eye, right? But that's basically what I do. You can see me working the trigger on my last video when I slow down and shoot. And that's where you're like, boom, and then you let it back out slow, and it goes click. And then you don't have to pull the whole trigger back. You just have to pull, boom, and pull a little bit. Yeah, a better trigger will help when you get out to long distances, because you're always, on a mil-spec trigger, you're always going to pull your shots off just a little bit. But you can land them in 300 yards. Or you can land them in 3 inches at 200 yards, no problem with the mil-spec trigger. But, you know, if you want to get one of those expensive, super great drop-in triggers that are like $600, you're more than welcome to. I like to try to just use what I have, and I may make upgrades to it at some point. But I like to focus on being able to use a typical trigger, because I might not have access to my gun with the real trigger, a really good trigger, in an emergency, right? So I like to try to focus on that. And I do sight in my iron sights. My AR-15 SBR has flip-up, back-up iron sights. So the back gun flips up, it can see through the scope. I also have the scope with the lighted radical. So if the battery goes dead, I still see a black radical, so I can still use the scope. But it could break or something, so I have the backup iron sights. And sometimes, I didn't in the last shooting video, but sometimes I flip those up and I look through the irons just to see if they're on and, you know, dead on. But yeah, getting proficient with being able to sight in a rifle and hit with your rifle is really important. It's an important thing to learn, an important thing to practice. So I'm all for people just going and buying AR-15s and loading up some 30-round magazines and having some fun blasting away at the range. But they also need to slow down, take their time. Like I was doing those 3-shot groups. I was working to get a sub 1 inch at 25 yards. This is as far as my range goes, but at a half-size target. So the bullet is still climbing, so I have to aim just a little bit low. And then the bullet's still kind of climbing right there, right? So it'll hit just a little higher. But at a real target at 50 yards, you would aim just dead on, right? So I'm kind of simulating shooting at 50 yards with a half-size target, but my point of impact is going to be a little higher than where I'm aiming at 25. If you can find a place to get it and stretch it out to 100 yards, 200 yards, that's great. But you can get pretty dead on with just this at your, local indoor range if you can shoot at least 10 yards, So I just think that people need to learn that and do that. There's so much stuff out there that makes it so complicated. Now, there are, like on high-end scopes, there are more adjustments. There are adjustments for the amount of wind that you have, how far you're shooting out. So if you're shooting at 600 yards, you give it this many clicks. There are also little identifiers in more expensive scopes to show the average size of a person. How big is he in your scope? You line up those marks, and that's how far away he is. So you can do that. There's all kinds of stuff, The Navy SEAL was teaching me all kinds of stuff when he taught me how to sight in my rifle. I stayed after the training that day, and he walked me through it. But I was kind of like, look, I don't have a $3,000 optic. I have the $30 red dot, So teach me how to sight this in, and maybe teach me a few extra little things along the way. And he was really patient and sat there and took his time and walked me through it. He was a big guy with big muscles too. But he was just the nicest guy you ever want to meet, and he was really good at teaching me how to do that. So, a lot of YouTube videos that talk about sighting in rifles, they use words like, oh, this many MOA and clicks and blah, 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 and they're not really explaining what all that means. So I just kind of wanted to do a video explaining it. And get out to the range and sight in your AR-15. All right, I'll talk to y'all later. This is Tom, your Frugal Prepper.